Hey everybody, happy Thursday. Yes, it's Thursday. Okay, so John chapter 19. Okay, so basically we just finished chapter 18, part 2, and we left off at Jesus standing before Pilate and basically telling him that he is a king. And so Pilate basically says to the Jewish people that are waiting outside, I don't see anything wrong with this guy, but you have a custom where I release one prisoner for you every Passover. So what do you want? Do you want this Jesus or do you want Barabbas? And they all shouted back, Barabbas. So basically, just to put it in context, when they said Barabbas, what they did was they made a choice between setting Jesus free and setting Barabbas free. And the reason why that is significant, as far as I understand, is because Jesus could have been set free, which means he would not have died at the hands of the Romans or the Jews, right? But because basically the Jews were not allowed to just kill a guy without a trial or without proper routine in place, especially on the Sabbath, which this was the Sabbath, or yeah. And so because of that, they needed, in a sense, they needed the Romans to kill him. And yet his blood had to be on the Jews' hands because it was his blood that would atone for the sins of Israel and the world, but really primarily for Israel, right? Because Jesus was the Passover lamb. And we'll see, I think it's in John, but the Pharisees basically, when Jesus gets condemned, the Pharisees shout out, his blood be on us and on our children, not realizing what they were saying, because it was Jesus, the Messiah's blood, that did have to be on them in order to give them the opportunity to be cleansed from their sin and to be made righteous. So they didn't even realize what they were saying, and yet they were prophesying, and they were saying, this is, his blood be on us and on our children. And he was the true Lamb of God. For years and centuries, the priests had been sacrificing lambs and spilling their blood as a temporary way of atoning for the sins of the people, to make up for the sins, right? To cover the sins. And right here is the Lamb of God, the pure, spotless Lamb of God, which all the world has been waiting for. And the Jews deliver him up to Rome, to get Rome to kill him. And, they say that. But then they also say, no, we want Barabbas, which means they chose to condemn Jesus to death, right? So really, even though the Romans killed him, the Pharisees basically killed him, really. The Jews killed him because he could have been set free, and they condemned him to death. An innocent man, whereas Barabbas was guilty. He was an insurrectionist and a murderer. So by rights, he should have died. But nope, they chose to set Barabbas free. So just a couple background things. So anyways, chapter 19, part 1, because I think it's, yeah, okay. So then Pilate took Jesus and had him scourged or flogged and whipped. And hold on, I'll just explain this. Because Pilate viewed Jesus as innocent, he may have ordered the beating, expecting that the Jews would consider it adequate punishment and consent to Jesus' release. Scourging was a horrific, brutal form of punishment. The glass and metal of the whip tore the body apart, exposing the vital organs. Men frequently died of scourging. Pretty intense, and this is what he went through for us. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe around him. And just another interesting piece of information, the thorns on the crown that they would have made for him, they weren't like little rose thorns. They were like this big. They were like 2 inches long and super spiky. So imagine people making a crown. So it wasn't just like one time around of these thorny things. It was like wrapped around and around. So these thorns were just sticking out everywhere, and they jammed that on his head, right? So that would have gone right down to his skull. Yeah. And you know what? You know what's crazy to think in the middle of all this, he could have called down angels and delivered himself and chosen to not go through it with it. He could have, but he didn't. He chose to humble himself and surrender himself to the point of death, even death on a cross, right? It's just crazy. Good crazy. So anyways, so they put a purple robe around him to mock him. And they kept coming up to him saying mockingly, "Hail, King of the Jews, good health, peace, long life to you, King of the Jews." And they slapped him in the face. Then Pilate came out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him, no crime, no cause for accusation." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Look, the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him, no crime, no cause for accusation." The Jews answered him, "We have a law regarding blasphemy, and according to that law he should die because he made himself out to be God." Now, that is like an extreme exaggeration. Yeah. So when Pilate heard this, he was even more alarmed and afraid. And there's just a little another. As a Roman pagan, Pilate would have been superstitious and may have feared that Jesus actually had some sort of magical or divine power. He went into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus didn't answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and I have the authority to crucify you?" I love this. This next verse, verse 11, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given to you from above." Right? So even there, the Father has allowed all of this to happen. And you know what? I'll finish this verse. I just love it. "For this reason, the sin and guilt of the one who handed me over to you is greater than your own." Right? So, and there's just this may refer to Judas Iscariot, but Caiaphas may be the more likely one since he was directly responsible for Jesus' going before Pilate. So basically, Jesus is saying, "Okay, Pilate, I recognize that I'm dying at the hands of the Jews, not necessarily at your hand, even though, yes, you are going to crucify me, but it's really the Jews' fault, the responsibility." And I'm not talking about, it had to be that way, right? The Jews killed Jesus, but Jesus had to die. Right? So, because there's a big, huge thing about a lot of Christians nowadays, mostly in the Western world and mostly in North America, there's a lot of people who are anti-Semitic, or AKA they hate the Jews, they're against the Jews, and they'll say, but you Jews killed Jesus, you Jews killed Jesus, you killed the Messiah, which is really stupid because he had to die, whether it was by the Jews' hands or by the Romans' hands or by my own hand. If it was just me and Jesus standing here and I was a sinner, I would have to kill him myself in order for things to be made right between me and my Father. He would still have to die for my sin. Okay, maybe I don't know if I'd have to kill him, but he would still have to die for my sin, even if it was just me and him, right? So it wouldn't matter if I was a Jew or not a Jew or, a Gentile or whatever, right? Jesus would still have to die. So don't get caught up in Jew hating because that's bad. And God, even today, gets really mad when people do not bless Israel and do not bless the Jews. So, but anyways, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given to you from above." And the reason I love this is because Jesus is basically saying, listen, you think you have authority to set me free or to crucify me, but the thing is you would have nothing unless my Father had already ordained for this to happen. So don't get too high on your horse here, buddy. Jesus is basically saying, listen, I'm submitting and surrendering myself to all this. As if saying, listen, you have no authority. In fact, in one of the other Gospels, he says, I lay my life down. Nobody takes it from me. I lay it down myself, right? Because it had to be that way. Jesus couldn't just be dragged against his will and crucified. Otherwise, it would not be by choice. It would not be innocent. It would not be, well, I guess it would be innocent, but he had to lay himself down. He had to be a willing sacrifice, right? Because if he wasn't willing, then it would be murder, which is very different, right? And so in another gospel, he says, I lay myself down and I will take my life back up again, right? And so he's basically saying, listen, me and my Father have had this plan before the beginning of the world. So don't think that you have any authority at all, except for what my Father's allowed you to have, right? And allowed the Pharisees to have, and allowed everybody else to have, that's made this possible, that's made this happen, right? And I think, again, it just shows the sovereignty of God in the world, in creation, in everything, I can't speak for non-believers, but I can speak for believers that, that God has our days planned out. And, he has everything written in his book, every plan that he has for us before the foundations of the world. And I just think it shows that he's not ever out of control. He is not ever shocked. He's not ever taken aback. He's not ever surprised. He always is sovereign in everything and in all things. So, anywho, so as a result of this, verse 12, Pilate kept making efforts to release him, but the Jews kept screaming, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar, which is a big deal because Pilate, his boss and emperor, was Caesar. And that could be seen as treason, right? If Pilate's trying to let somebody go who, they think is guilty. Anyone who makes himself out to be a king oppresses Caesar or opposes Caesar and rebels against the emperor. So Pilate would be seen to be coercing? No, not coercing. There's a word. Anyway, supporting Jesus's claims to be a king. And since Caesar is supposedly the only king, that would be treason and blah, blah, blah. So that's why they're saying that. And when Pilate heard this, that was pretty much what set his mind. He brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover week, which, yeah, okay. I've got all these little stars. And it was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, look, your king. But they shouted, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Quite the hypocritical statement coming from them, who all they wanted was to overthrow Rome, and they just weren't powerful enough to do so. Hence why they were waiting for the Messiah, who they thought would come and overthrow Rome and deliver them, and and yet here they are saying, oh, we have no king but Caesar, because they just wanted to get their way, and they would do anything to get their way. So yeah, this is, it's not very far down. Okay, yeah, I've only got a minute and a half. Okay, so then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And there's just a couple. The vertical post remained permanently in the ground, and Jesus carried the crossbeam. So after all that beating, all that scourging, he must have been ripped apart. Well, the Bible talks about how, I can't remember if it's in one of the prophets or the Psalms, where it says that he was beaten beyond recognition, beyond, literally to a pulp. Nobody has been beaten as bad as he was, right? And it said he was beaten for our transgressions, and he was just wrecked for our iniquities, right? The worst beating in the history of beatings he took for us, right? And then he had to carry his own crossbeam. How nice. But it was all for a purpose, and we are getting to that purpose. So we will continue with verse 18 in chapter 18 or 19, part 2. Take care.